As General Yoshijiro Umezu carefully studies the papers on his desk, his brow begins to furrow. The General Staff of the Imperial Japanese Navy has presented him with a proposal that seems almost unbelievable. His eyes dart up and down the pages as he takes in the incredible details: massive submarines, the largest ever built, launching specially designed aircraft on a one-way mission to the west coast of the United States. A weapon potentially more deadly than any conventional bomb. Suddenly, a name jumps off the page. Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, director of the notorious Unit 731, Ishii, already responsible for some of the war's most horrific atrocities in China, is now apparently collaborating with the Navy on a shocking new scheme, one that threatens to drag a modern war into the horrors of medieval plague. Umezu slowly looks up and sets the documents down. If he allows this operation to proceed, it could dramatically shift Japan's failing war fortunes. It might even secure them victory. But the consequences of such a decision could resonate far beyond the battlefield, leaving a stain the world might never forgive. In 1944. As Japan's position in the war became increasingly desperate, the seeds of a terrifying new plan were sown. After their initial success in the Pacific following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, and their rapid expansion into territories such as the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and Burma, Japan found itself being pushed back. Allied forces were advancing steadily across the Pacific, getting closer to the Japanese home islands, with their fleets severely weakened and few conventional options left. Japan's naval leadership began considering more radical ways to strike back at the Americans directly on their own soil. In December 1944, Vice Admiral Ishii Ozawa, Vice Chief of the Naval General Staff and Director of the Naval War College, proposed an audacious new plan. With Japan suffering devastating losses in naval battles like the Philippine Sea, Ozawa was determined to find a strategy that wouldn't require Japan's remaining ships to engage the US Navy head. What he proposed was an unconventional form of warfare, one designed to spread fear and chaos across the American population through a surprise biological attack. To carry out this plan, Ozawa turned to one of the most feared and controversial figures in Japan's military, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. Ishii was a microbiologist and army medical officer who headed Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's secret biological warfare division. From a sprawling facility in the Pingfang district of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, Unit 731 conducted grotesque experiments and developed various chemical and biological weapons. Civilians and prisoners of war were subjected to horrific treatment, vivisections without anesthesia, deliberate infections with deadly diseases, and gruesome weapons testing. Among all of Unit 731's monstrous achievements, one stood out to Ozawa. In earlier operations, the unit had deployed bombs filled with plague-infected fleas against Chinese cities like Ningbo and Changde. These air raids unleashed the same pathogen responsible for the medieval Black Death, causing widespread death and terror. Survivors recalled entire cities shutting down in panic, with people locking their doors, markets closing, and schools abandoned. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical toll. The idea soon emerged to use similar tactics against the United States. In March 1942, during the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, military leaders briefly considered releasing 150 million plague-infected fleas in 10 separate attacks against US and Filipino forces in Bataan. But the Americans surrendered before the plan could be implemented. 2 years later, in the summer of 1944, another biological warfare detachment was sent to Saipan, only to be wiped out by advancing US forces. Now, Japan's naval leadership believed they could revive these efforts and direct them at us. Cities on the west coast. They envisioned an aerial assault using plague-infected fleas dropped by aircraft secretly launched from submarines just offshore. The mission was named Operation PX, referring to the codename for the infected fleas. It also became known by a more poetic and misleading title, Operation Cherry. Blossoms at night, beneath the serene imagery, lay a plan for devastation. Asterisk, the aim wasn't just to cause mass casualties. Ozawa hoped the attack would also plunge American society into panic and disrupt the economy, thereby weakening the Allied war effort and giving Japan a final chance to turn the tide. But such a bold operation would require an extraordinary level of secrecy and technology. Direct attacks from aircraft carriers were too risky. They would be detected before getting close enough to the US coast. Instead, the Navy turned to its most advanced and ambitious submarine project, the I-400 class. Asterisk, these submarines were engineering marvels, longer than a football field and weighing over 6,500 tons. Submerged nearly twice the size of their American counterparts, they would hold the title of the world's largest submarines until the nuclear-powered subs of the Cold War. Though difficult to maneuver and slow to dive, they had one critical advantage: an extraordinary range of over 40,000 miles. They could circle the globe more than once on a single fuel load, easily allowing them to reach the US coast undetected. Asterisk, the entire Pacific had to be crossed in one journey, and the submarines built for the mission incorporated advanced features for their time. They were equipped with specialized trim systems that allowed them to remain stationary while submerged and coated with an anechoic layer to help avoid sonar detection. For the operation, 5 of these massive vessels were meant to stealthily make their way across the ocean, a difficult task given the strong winds that could push their large superstructures off course. Their helmsman needed to constantly correct the direction by steering 7 degrees to starboard, just to stay on a straight path. Asterisk, inside each submarine was a 100-foot-long watertight hangar, accessed through a hydraulically operated door. Each hangar carried 3 IHEM-6 Asiran floatplanes. Once the submarine surfaced near the California coast under the cover of night, the crew would begin a complex 30-minute process to retrieve the planes, unfold their wings, and prepare them for launch using compressed air catapults. The intended target was San Diego, with the hope that the disease would then spread north to Los Angeles and San Francisco. Asterisk. There was debate over the best method for exposing the American population to the infected fleas. One possibility was to use bombs, similar to the tactics employed in China. A more disturbing option proposed instructing the pilots to crash their aircraft into densely populated areas to maximize infection. Another, even more extreme plan called for the submarine crews to infect themselves with the plague and go ashore to spread the disease directly among civilians. Asterisk. By March 26, preparations for the operation were complete. However, despite the enthusiasm from the Navy General Staff, two major problems emerged. First, only 2 of the 5 I-400 submarines, specifically the I-400 and I-401, had been completed. And with Japan's resources stretched thin, completing the remaining 3 seemed unlikely. Second, and more significantly, the plan met resistance from General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Army General Staff. His objection wasn't only military, it was ethical. He warned that launching a biological attack would escalate the conflict beyond a war between Japan and the United States, turning it into a universal war between humanity and disease. He cautioned that Japan would be condemned by the world for such an action. Asterisk, his words carried considerable influence. Soon after the plan was finalized, it was shelved. But this was not yet the end of the operation. As Japan's situation worsened dramatically during the summer of 1945, interest in the plan was revived. Allied forces were now closing in on the Japanese mainland. Cities were being devastated by bombing raids, and the Imperial Navy had been reduced to a shell of its former power. Even Umezu began to reconsider, seeing biological weapons as a last resort option to prolong the war. Asterisk, by then, however, only 1 additional I-400 submarine had been completed, and it had been converted during construction into a tanker, making it unsuitable for the mission. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender after being struck by 2 atomic bombs. Despite this, Lieutenant General Ishii was still unwilling to abandon the use of biological warfare. He proposed a final act of self-sacrifice, suggesting that he and a group of soldiers infect themselves and spread the diseases among Allied occupation forces entering Japan. This idea, too, was blocked by Umezu and General Toroshiro Kawabe, who asked Ishii to wait for another opportunity. That opportunity never came. Although Ishii was responsible for countless deaths through his work with Unit 731, he was granted immunity from prosecution by the United States in exchange for his research data. A group of American military microbiologists, led by Lieutenant Colonel Murray Sanders, considered the information to be valuable, noting in their report that it could never have been ethically obtained through experiments in the U.S. Ishii later lectured American officers at Fort Detrick on biological weapons. Vice Admiral Ozawa, who had spearheaded the planning of the operation, also escaped punishment. He later served as an advisor to the Japanese Defense Agency and lived until 1966. Ironically, it was General Umezu the man who played a key role in preventing the operation from being carried out, who was arrested by Allied authorities. He was tried as a war criminal and found guilty of waging aggressive war. Sentenced to life in prison, he died of rectal cancer in 1949 while still incarcerated. The enormous I-400 submarines built for the mission were captured by American forces after Japan's surrender. Realizing the advanced technology they contained, and determined to prevent it from falling into Soviet hands during the early stages of the Cold War, the U.S. military deliberately sank them. The wreck of the I-400 was not discovered until 2013 off the coast of Hawaii. Silent reminder of a plan that came dangerously close to unleashing a new kind of horror on the world during World War II.